Hey there, this is Ari. Welcome back to the show. Before we get into today's episode, I want to let you know about one of the biggest hidden causes of fatigue that most people never really consider, and that is nutrient deficiencies. First of all, did you know that your body requires over 30 different vitamins and minerals in adequate or optimal amounts in order to facilitate energy production? Okay, that's a simple fact. Now, consider this pretty shocking fact. Over 9 out of 10 people have at least one deficiency in those different nutrients. Okay, now to break it down even further, over 50% of people don't meet the recommended daily allowances for things like vitamin A, calcium, and magnesium. And if you look at data on the percentage of the population in the US that are not meeting the recommended daily allowance for many of these different vitamins and minerals, here's what we find. And this is the actual data. So you see things like deficiencies in B vitamins like riboflavin and niacin and thiamine and B12 and B6 are extremely common. Over 1 in 3 people, or around 1 in 3 people, are deficient in at least one of those things. Then you have folate, which is another B vitamin. Over 75% of the population is not getting adequate levels of folate. These are critical cofactors involved in energy production at the cellular level. And deficiencies are shockingly common. Then you have other, minerals. You have things like zinc deficiency, magnesium deficiency, calcium deficiency, vitamin E deficiency, vitamin C deficiency. And we can see on and on and on that, 50% or more of the population is deficient in at least one of those things. So putting this all together, the vast majority of the population have a deficiency in at least one of these things, and more than likely 3 to 5 or even upwards of 8 to 10 deficiencies in these various nutrients that are needed for optimal health and energy production. And this is the reason that we formulated our new supplement, Energy Essentials and Superfoods. It is absolutely packed with a bunch of incredible superfoods, things like spirulina, chlorella, moringa, pomegranate, blueberry extract, bilberry, all kinds of really incredible superfoods with proven health benefits from dozens and dozens of studies. But more to the point of this, it is a comprehensive, ultra premium vitamin and mineral formula with all of the absolute best, most optimal, most bioavailable forms of all of these different vitamins and minerals to make sure that every day when you take this cocktail, you are flooding your body with adequate amounts of all of these different nutrients that are needed for your cells to express optimal health and optimal energy levels. So go check it out. It's an amazing formula. I think you're going to be blown away by the results. And I think you're going to be blown away by the research behind a lot of these compounds that are in this formula. So you can find that at store.theenergyblueprint.com. And again, it's called the Energy Essentials and Superfoods. And they are, as the name implies, the essentials for optimal energy levels and health. Because if you don't have adequate amounts of these foundational nutrients that are needed for your cells to produce energy, of course, this is going to be a major hidden cause of fatigue. So go check it out, Energy Essentials and Superfoods. You can get it at store.theenergyblueprint.com. Hey there, welcome back to the Energy Blueprint podcast. I am here with someone who I have wanted to interview for a very long time. I've been following his work and his articles on his website for, I think, at least 4 or 5 years now. His name is Cort Johnson, and he is a very big advocate for people with ME/CFS. He is the founder and director of Health Rising, which is a website dedicated to covering the latest research and treatment possibilities for chronic fatigue syndrome, ME/CFS, and fibromyalgia. Cort came down with ME/CFS/FM, fibromyalgia, while engaged in an environmental studies program at the University of California at Santa Cruz during the 1980s. He went on to, he's done a whole bunch of other things since then, but obviously that personal experience with it kind of was the catalyst for his interest and obsession with ME/CFS. But dissatisfied with the level of content on ME/CFS on the web, he decided to take a deep dive into the research on that subject. The result in 2004 was a basic content-based website focused on explicating ME/CFS research and treatment called Phoenix Rising. By 2010, that became the most visited ME/CFS website on the internet. And then in December 2012, Cort left Phoenix Rising to form Health Rising and broadened his focus to include fibromyalgia. Over time, he's produced over 1,000 blogs on ME/CFS and FM that have been hailed for their comprehensiveness and depth. And I can attest to that. I've read probably not all 1,000 of them, but I've read probably a couple hundred of them. And they are excellent articles talking about the latest research on the subject. So with all that said, such a pleasure to finally connect with you, Cort.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I have to say that even though I was astounded that I've written almost around 1,000 or over 1,000 blogs, and I have at times stumbled across my articles and read them and thought they were very good, not realizing that I'd written them. So so there's a lot of content there, not all of which I can keep up with. So
that's good that you're reading your articles and you're like, man, this guy really knows his stuff.
Who is that person?
Nice. So
Oh my gosh.
with having said that, you've been doing this, you've had an interest in this since your personal experience back in the 1980s, and you've been doing this for, I guess 2 decades-ish at this point. What do you think is the best broad overview as far as understanding what is going on physiologically in ME/CFS? I mean, there was a time for a long time where doctors just interpreted as a psychosomatic phenomenon, and would tell patients, there's nothing wrong with you. Here's some antidepressants, right? So
Right.
what's changed since then within mainstream thinking on ME/CFS, and what do you think is the most compelling explanation for what's going on physiologically, metabolically in those with ME/CFS?
Well, that's a great question. There's no doubt a tremendous amount has changed. Well, since I came down with it, for sure, and really a lot has changed recently, and I think a tremendous amount is going to change over the next couple of years, and I think that's because of the long COVID situation, and as many people probably know, the long COVID patients, many of them are looking very much like ME/CFS patients. And so that's too bad for them. Yeah, but that's good news for us. And I must say, if you're going to come down with this disease or something like this disease, now is just the best time ever. If you have to, now is just the best time ever. For one, we've been struggling for years to get money out of the National Institutes of Health, which is basically, they've just neglected this disease terribly. It affects from 1 to 2.5 million people in the U.S. And studies have shown that it's more functionally disabling than diseases like heart disease and heart failure and kidney disease. Believe it or not, people with ME/CFS, they are significantly more functionally disabled than people with those very serious diseases. And so we've been pounding on the NIH for years to increase our funding, and they really haven't. I mean, it fell to just incredibly low depths about 6 or 7 years ago, and they bumped it up a little bit, but it's still just a pitiful amount of funding. So, and just on a side note, so ME/CFS is largely, not completely, but much of it is a post-infectious disease. It's triggered, for most people, it's triggered by infections. And the NIH had a lot of opportunities to find out what happens to the body when you have an infection, when an infection occurs, and then it lapses into this long-term chronic illness, and they turn their noses up at that. And so now here we are with the long COVID patients, and with hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people, uh, coming down with this very debilitating, potentially very debilitating illness, and nobody knows what to do. So the good news is that the NIH has received over $1 billion to study long COVID. So that's going to make a tremendous difference for them. We've never had anywhere near that kind of funding. So that's going to make a tremendous difference for them. It's going to make a tremendous difference for us. And I fully anticipate we're going to have some real breakthroughs are going to show up over the next couple of years, because there's going to a ton of research is going to go into determining what happens when somebody gets an infection and they don't recover. So that's the good news. That doesn't really answer your question. We have a big clue with regards to ME/CFS, and that's post-exertional malaise, which is a term that was actually introduced into the medical lexicon by chronic fatigue syndrome, because problems with exertion are play such a role in this disease. So early on, we had a group of exercise physiologists from a small university in Northern California, one of whom had chronic fatigue syndrome, and she started doing these unusual exercise tests. They're called 2-day maximal exercise tests, and these tests are unusual, not because they were new, but because they haven't been done by the medical profession for so many years. And the reason they haven't been done by the medical profession is that they've been tried in all sorts of conditions, all sorts of serious conditions again. And what they found is if you put a person, even with heart disease or heart failure, all sorts of, really, really very serious conditions, if you put them on a bike one day and you have them exercise to exhaustion, and then you put them on a bike the next day, you have them exercise to exhaustion again, they can still put out the same amount of energy the second day that they did the first day. And when she put people with chronic fatigue syndrome on the bike, though, they could not do that. During that first exercise period, something happened to their ability to produce energy, which made them unable to produce the same amount of energy the next day. These researchers, they're called the Workwell Foundation, and they just on the side they do these kind of rock solid disability tests, because they can actually show a functional impairment happening in chronic fatigue syndrome. So as they dug deeper into these exercise tests, they found that people with chronic fatigue syndrome, they enter into something called anaerobic energy production very quickly, and they exit out of aerobic energy production very quickly. Now, aerobic energy production is where the body uses oxygen to produce ATP, and it's very efficient. It's a very clean form of energy, and it's a form of energy healthy people use when they exercise. Mm-hmm. So, but people with chronic fatigue syndrome, unfortunately, they're out of it, and they're relying on anaerobic energy production. And in anaerobic energy production, you just produce a little ATP, and it comes at a great cost of. It produces toxic byproducts, and it produces symptoms like fatigue and pain. So that was a big clue that the aerobic energy production systems of people with chronic fatigue syndrome are broken. Mm-hmm. And when they dug deeper, they also found that some people with chronic fatigue syndrome were not able to, their ventilation, they weren't able to pump as much oxygen into their lungs as healthy people. They found their heart rate wasn't able to keep track as it should with exercise. They weren't able to accelerate their heart rate to the right amount, and they're producing too much lactate. So right there we have a very we have a really good explanation. We don't know why it's happening, but we have evidence that something has gone really wrong with their people with their energy production system.
So right there, I mean, that's one of the big shifts in mainstream thinking around ME/CFS over the last few decades, is what was once thought to be a purely psychosomatic thing. You know, it's all in the head. These are just hypochondriacs. These are depressed people. Now we actually have quite a lot of solid research showing that there are very real physiological abnormalities in these individuals. Is that accurate to say?
Yes, yes, and it's getting better. A couple of years ago, a Harvard pulmonologist named David Systrom, he started doing invasive cardiopulmonary tests on people with chronic fatigue syndrome, and in these invasive cardiopulmonary tests, he puts a catheter into an artery, a catheter into a vein, and he can measure the amount of blood that's going to the muscles. He can measure the amount of oxygen and all sorts of things. So when he did these tests on people with chronic fatigue syndrome, he found that about half of them, they were not utilizing oxygen. That is, he could measure the oxygen content going to the muscles, and then when it came back on the other side, the oxygen levels were too high. That for some reason, their muscles were not utilizing oxygen properly. And he's uncovered 3 different reasons for this in chronic fatigue syndrome. One of which is mitochondrial dysfunction. He believes a mitochondrial dysfunction is happening in some patients. One of which is hyperventilation. And this is not a psychological reaction. This is a physiological problem, which is causing somehow the signals for breathing are getting disrupted. And when a significant number of people get on a bicycle, they're breathing too deeply and too rapidly, which is reducing the CO2 levels, which is in their blood, which actually makes it more difficult for oxygen to leave the red blood vessels and flow into the mitochondria. And the third one is problems with the microcirculation. And he's finding that that he's measuring the blood going down to the muscles, and he's measuring it coming back from the muscles, and there's less blood coming back from the muscles. So somewhere along there, blood is getting dispersed into the system, and he believes it's kind of getting shunted away from the muscles at some point. So here's another real validation, you know. And this guy is from Harvard, you know. This guy is well respected, you know. He didn't start out in this field. He's somebody people will listen to, and that it's been hard to get other researchers to listen to the exercise physiologists in this field. These findings are so unique that they say, well, your machine must be broken, because we've never seen this before.
Right. So there's just to summarize that. So there's a did you say there's a defect from, you know, as far as the blood going to the muscles or to the cells? Is there a defect there? Did he find that there's less blood flow or less oxygen in the blood?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yes. There, it's somewhere blood is being lost, probably before it reaches the muscles.
Okay.
And therefore, you know, it makes it hard to produce energy.
So we have a defect there somewhere in the cardiopulmonary system. There's defects. We have a number of lines of evidence suggesting there's defects at the cellular level and at the mitochondrial level as far as the ability to use oxygen and efficiently produce energy. And then there's also defects after that as far as the blood going back to the heart and and decreased CO2 levels and too high of oxygen in the returning blood and so on.
Oh, you got that very quickly. Yes.
Okay. So one of the things that I think is interesting, and maybe this is something we'll explore now or later on, but as I see it, I see two very different sort of fundamental ways of thinking about solving these problems.
Okay.
On the one hand, I think you have the allopathic paradigm, conventional medical paradigm, that is very much looking for the physiological defect, the biochemical mechanism that is problematic in this condition, and then looking for some kind of drug intervention that will correct this dysfunctional biochemical pathway. So the analogy, if somebody's not following, is, let's say blood pressure is too high, let's use a drug that alters some of the signaling of something involved in the blood pressure regulation system so that we lower blood pressure. Or
Okay.
if cholesterol levels are too high, then let's use statin drugs and just help the body make less of those cholesterol molecules.
Right.
So that's kind of how conventional medicine thinks about solving problems. But even just with what you've said so far, with what's going on in ME/CFS, and I think you'd probably agree that even that's just kind of scratching the surface as far as all of the findings of all the different things that we know are going wrong in
Right.
people
Sure.
with ME/CFS. My point is, there is no one specific system and one specific biochemical pathway that seems to be the thing that's going wrong. And so from my perspective, I think it's going to be unlikely that we're going to find a drug cure to ME/CFS. It's possible that I'm wrong, especially if Dr. Robert Naviaux is right. Maybe something that would block purinergic signaling.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that could be some kind of universal cure. But in my experience, I think it's very rare to find drug cures for most diseases. And
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
anyway,
Sure.
all of this is to say, what do you think of these two sort of fundamental approaches to solving this problem? Do you think that it is likely? Are you hopeful that there will be a drug cure? Do you think that that's the most likely answer?
Well, that's the answer I would like to have.
I think we'd all like to have it for everything.
But as you say, this is unlikely in disease in general, let alone something as complex as chronic fatigue syndrome.
Mhm.
Now, I do believe it's possible that a drug, and I actually believe that ME/CFS will be most resolved. Well, that at some point a drug will come along that will make a big difference. It'll take a lot more research, but I just think it has to, because unless we come up with some super supplement, and I mean, I should say that we have a bunch of recovery stories on Health Rising, and they cover the gamut. There are people who've recovered using ketogenic diets.
Mhm.
There are people who've recovered using blood volume enhancers. There's people who've recovered using antivirals. There are people who've recovered using functional medicine, in which they do a whole bunch of things, and they just slowly work their way out of this illness. That is certainly a possibility.
Yeah,
Uh,
I can speak to my work in that regard, and not that I specialize in ME/CFS specifically, but I certainly have lots of people that have followed my work, done my program, and
yes.
used my supplements. And I have, with specifically ME/CFS, probably somewhere in the order of 50 to 100 recovery stories.
Oh, great.
With full-blown ME/CFS that have fully recovered from that.
Well,
Using
there you go.
nutrition, lifestyle modification, nutritional supplements, a comprehensive regimen of lots and lots of strategies.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
that's not to say that everyone with ME/CFS has recovered. I think that there are some people with very, very severe ME/CFS that maybe is from like a combination of severe mold poisoning or mercury poisoning, or I've had one story of a woman who grew up in England in a specific town. I forget the name of the place, but it was famous for having a lead poisoning incident in the public
Sure.
water supply. And so she, from the time she was 8 years old, she had like insanely high levels of lead in her system. And,
Right.
she's now
Right.
55 years old and she's been toxic in lead for 40 years, and I think there are scenarios like that where it's probably very difficult to get back to the level of health that you were in your pre-8-year-old self. But all of this is to say that I do think recovery seems to be possible for a large number of people.
Um, yeah. Yeah. Um, um, the well, the I'm not sure what to say. That's a great. I mean, you're getting a lot of recovery stories. That's great. Um, and on the website, I deal with so many people who have tried so many different approaches and nothing has worked. Maybe they're just not. And I've tried so many different things, and I'm always hopeful that maybe I'm just missing something. That I'm missing that essential ingredient. And one of the challenges really with the functional medicine approach is that there are so many different things to try.
Right.
And so, but certainly, we have stories on Health Rising, where people they put the right endpoints in, and they've done their pacing, and they've been careful with their diet, and they just work their way out of it. It's amazing, really, to go from such a functionally debilitated state to health. And it seems like with some people, they just, they get to a point, and all of a sudden they turn a corner. It's like they're somehow it's all kind of come together, and there they are. you
Mhm.
know so um like with me, I'm pretty mild, most relative to most people, and I just, it's a problem for many people. It's a problem of money, getting the right help. And certainly your courses can really help with that, since they are available online.
Yeah.
So it's certainly worth a try. I certainly, yeah, it actually makes me think I should try.
Well, happy to help out. And one thing I don't advertise, you mentioned, people financially struggling there. I don't
Yeah.
necessarily advertise this, but I guess I am now. People who are in financial difficulties, if they provide some evidence to that, bank statements or something to that effect, we never turn someone down who is in need of the course, but can't actually afford it.
Great.
So anyway,
Great.
so we talked about some cardiopulmonary deficits. You mentioned mitochondrial dysfunction. I know you're familiar with Dr. Robert Naviaux's work around
Mhm.
the metabolomic studies and kind of the cell danger response and all of that. What is your opinion about the idea that there's a sort of hibernation aspect of what's going on in terms of the physiology of people with ME/CFS?
I think it's a fascinating idea. It's certainly intuitively it kind of fits. Um, and it's it it this is it's an interesting, because it's coming at the problem with energy production from a different angle, and it's finding the same thing, and that is these metabolomic studies where they assess the metabolites in the blood and the urine. They also suggest that people with ME/CFS are in a hypometabolic or a hibernation state.
Mhm.
And Navio, of course, um, has been a real leader here, um, with the cell danger response, and interestingly, the mitochondria being the kind of the quick alert, providing the quick alert system for the body. Um, and so you know, and I think it's a very viable hypothesis. Some researchers from Australia, Neil McGregor and Chris Armstrong, they've been doing metabolomic studies for quite a while, and they have found that people with ME/CFS are preferentially using amino acids for energy, that they're not doing well with carbohydrates, which again are the glucose, which provides a quick clean bursts of energy. So for some reason, their results indicate that people with ME/CFS are breaking down their muscles to produce energy. You know, it's another inefficient way to produce energy. And then there's Marion Limley, who, gosh, 10 or 15 years ago, she came up with the hydrogen sulfide hypothesis, and she got that out of looking at hibernation presentation. She got onto that, and that's being studied at Johns Hopkins right now. So I think it's a very interesting hypothesis. And I should mention that the metabolomic results, they mirror what happens with people who are starving. You know, so when you're starving, you go to your muscles to produce energy, and for some reason that seems to be happening in chronic fatigue syndrome.
Yeah,
and that's actually jiving with some of the mitochondrial results, which suggests that the electron transport chain is working okay, but the point right before that is broken. Yeah. So how in your program, how do you attack this hypometabolic problem? Is there a specific strategy to deal with that, or?
Yeah, I think what I was getting at a minute ago, and I asked you kind of about these two fundamental approaches to how people approach and think about solving health problems, I think is a real important dividing line. And there are different levels of thought, levels of analyzing and understanding a problem. And when you analyze and understand a problem in a totally different way, you're going to arrive at different solutions. So I'll give you an example. Let's imagine two different people who are trying to farm land. This is actually I'm writing a script for a video I'm about to film. So people listening might hear me talk about this in another video, but let's imagine you have two different groups of scientists who are trying to farm land and make it as productive as possible. And one of those groups of scientists has a very naturalistic paradigm, an appreciation for nature, a desire to mimic nature and nature's ways of doing things. And the other one says, nature schmature. You know, we can use modern technology and modern science and do way better than nature can do. And we can, for example, we don't have to rely on manual labor to plant all the seeds in the ground and water, irrigate all the things and put chemicals on the crops. We can just automatize that and use machines to do it all by just planting the same crop on this whole field of 100 acres. We can just plant one plant instead of a diversity of plants like this in nature.
Sure.
We can just do one plant, right?
Modern agriculture.
Right.
Yeah.
And then, so we only farm soy or we only farm corn or something like that. And great, it is hyper efficient in many ways. You don't have to use so much manual labor. You can use machines to plant and to harvest and so on. But then you run into certain problems. You find, those methods are depleting the topsoil and they're heavily depleting the soil of minerals. And because there's no diversity of plants, now the plants are very susceptible to pests. And so they say, no problem, science to the rescue. We'll just create chemical fertilizers that replenish the minerals, and we'll create chemical herbicides and pesticides to deal with all the weeds and pest problems that we're getting. Problem solved. We've got our chemical drug solutions to all of our health problems of our field. But then you discover, there's other problems. Now all these chemical fertilizers and herbicides and pesticides are running into the rivers and the lakes. and the oceans, where they're wreaking havoc on the wildlife, where they're bleaching the coral reefs and disturbing the whole ecosystem of the entire planet, right? And so now you have other groups of scientists trying to develop drugs to solve those problems, right? And so there's a whole cascade of problems that emerge because you didn't start from the right set of assumptions. But there's another way of doing things, which is to replicate nature, to use more permaculture systems that rotate the crops in a certain way, that use a diversity of plants, that minimize, that make it so you don't deplete the topsoil, you don't deplete the minerals in the soil, and you make everything resistant to pests. So you don't require all of those chemical inputs that led to all of that whole cascade of problems on the whole planet, right? So these are, in my mind, two fundamentally distinct problems. Now, I start with an appreciation for nature, and just as if you break a bone, or you smack your head, or you smash your toe on something, or you fall off your bike and scrape your skin, your body has a natural drive, an innate drive to heal itself, to recognize where there is damage and to heal itself. But it does that a lot better if you provide it with the right inputs. And if you don't provide it with the right inputs, then it doesn't heal very efficiently. And routine infections, I just moved to Costa Rica recently, and I heard stories of, people who are living in poverty who don't have the ability to give their children with routine infections, with diarrhea, with common cold, with flu. They don't have the ability to feed them proper nutrition. So you have little kids, 1-2-year-old kids, who are dying from common colds and normal childhood infections, just because they're not given the proper inputs that their body need to be able to recover from that injury, that stressor, that insult, right? So I fundamentally conceptualize things from that paradigm, and I think that's in general a good guiding paradigm. So my fundamental question is basically, how can we provide all of the right inputs for human physiology to thrive and work at its optimum? So that's a long, I'm talking too much in your interview, but that's how I conceptualize problems.
Well, there's some really interesting techniques, and I wonder what you think of some of these, and some of these interesting nutrient delivery systems. There's been some like Nancy Klimas at Nova Southeastern. She is she's experimenting with a 2-drug approach that's staggered over time to get at the neuroinflammation and the stress response problems in chronic fatigue syndrome. But she's also really interested in finding other ways to calm down neuroinflammation, one of which is through intranasal glutathione. And she's interested in, I believe she's interested in intranasal insulin. I don't know if you've tried those, but that's an interesting way to perhaps get stuff into the brain. There's increasing evidence of neuroinflammation in chronic fatigue syndrome, which could be at the heart of all of this.
Right. Yeah, I was going to ask you about the brain component. In my experience, I've seen people with ME/CFS, I've seen them recover from nutritional interventions and circadian and sleep interventions. I've seen them recover from mitochondrial targeted supplements. And I've also seen people who haven't had a lot of success with those things, but who have had amazing success, where their big key was actually the brain-based interventions, was learning meditative techniques and other techniques, NLP-based techniques to calm the negative thought patterns and the stress that's going on in the brain. And I've seen people say, nothing's worked for me except these brain-based modalities. And, obviously, that there are certain people out there, the Gupta program and a few others that are doing very brain-focused programs. And I think for a subset of people that's quite effective.
Sure. Yes, I agree. I mean, and we have some stories on Health Rising. It's kind of a touchy subject, but there is something going on with the stress response system. I feel it. I mean, I intuitively feel it. This kind of fight or flight system that just will not quit. And there's physiological evidence to back that up. And, with the limbic system of the brain, hyperactivated, hypervigilant. I mean, it's there, it's there for me.
Yeah.
I don't know where it comes from. It's not a psychological, it's not, I mean, it came with chronic fatigue syndrome. When I got chronic fatigue syndrome, it came with it, this kind of hyped up, difficult to relax, difficult to rest and digest, difficult to get that parasympathetic nervous system going. And so, yeah, I think anything that can calm the fires down, is helpful. I just intuitively feel, I actually feel that if I could get that under control, I would be in really good shape.
Mm.
And I have actually worked at these things for a while. I don't know if it's because I just work too hard or I'm too driven, or if I could just relax for 6 months. I don't know. But
There's
so
some interesting,
they've had just enough success to keep me going,
right.
but not enough to get me there.
There's
But
some interesting research on people with type A, quote unquote, self-critical perfectionist personality types,
right, right,
uh, who tend to be, very driven, these people who are very perfectionist, these people who tend to have a lot of thought patterns, kind of beating themselves up over things, that they have a higher propensity for both burnout as well as ME/CFS. So there, when I was listening to you talk there, I hear someone who's very driven to work hard, and I think probably a lot of people with ME/CFS would identify with that.
sure. And really, how can you not be, in addition, how can you not be self-critical
Mm-hmm.
when you're out of the workforce, when you're not bringing in money, when you're not doing the things that provide status in our culture, you know. Uh, so you have that laid on top of everything else.
Mm-hmm.
It's a tough road to hoe, to not be working, to not be productive. That comes with its own baggage, there's its own stress. There's own stress overlay from that. But I really think that these subconscious impulses, um, I think they're part and parcel of the disease. I actually think they're probably part of the sickness behavior response that gets triggered when you have a cold, which is designed to isolate you, and it's designed to have you conserve your energy. I think it's all packaged together. And I plus in ME/CFS, there's a problem with energy production. I think there's probably a problem with the blood vessels delivering, you know, you know, enough blood flow to the muscles and to the brain. We just a fantastic study last year, really a seminal study, which showed that everybody with chronic fatigue syndrome, not just people who've been diagnosed with POTS or neural mediated hypotension, everybody with chronic fatigue syndrome, when they stand up, they have reduced blood flows to the brain.
Mm-hmm.
So, there's the CO2 thing that shows up, low CO2 levels.
Yeah.
So now I'm wondering whether these breathing techniques that can raise the CO2 levels, whether that's a viable option. And I'm looking into that too. Wouldn't that be nice, to have?
I've seen some, people were talking about Buteyko breathing, some advocates of
Yes,
Buteyko breathing
yes,
who I've actually seen some articles where they've made reference to working with chronic fatigue syndrome patients and saying they've found, remarkable improvement by doing these breathing techniques. Unfortunately, I think when I actually went to find the research, the actual like peer-reviewed publication, I think I wasn't able to find anything. So
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
there's certain claims floating around out there. As far as I can tell, I haven't been able to actually locate the actual studies, but
Hmm.
it's possible, especially given what you said, that there is low CO2 levels. And for people listening, Cort mentioned this earlier, but basically there's something called the Bohr effect, BOHR, if you want to look it up, that has to do with how CO2 levels impact on the ability of oxygen to be released from the red blood cell that's floating around in the blood, so that oxygen can get into the cell. So this is a counterintuitive thing for most people, because they hear like, why would I want to raise my CO2 levels? Isn't CO2 just this waste product that I want to get rid of? Well, in reality, CO2 plays a very important role in allowing for oxygen to be delivered effectively to the cell. So if you don't have high enough CO2 levels, that doesn't happen as efficiently. And if you can't get oxygen efficiently into the cells, obviously you get problems with energy production. So anyway, just the background to help people understand that. But I do think it's possible that these breathing techniques can make an impact.
Yes. Yes. Well, there's this interesting, and I'm sure you've heard of Wim Hof.
Yeah.
With his with cold immersion and breathing techniques. And I mean, I read a book written by somebody who worked with him, and he brought these middle-aged, out of shape people, some of them with some serious diseases, and they climbed that mountain in Africa, Kilimanjaro. And he was told that he was going to lose some people on that trip.
Mhm.
And they actually survived, and they did very well. So, and there's this idea of cold immersion. Cold, as I understand it, activates the parasympathetic nervous system. And there are some studies that show that brief periods of really intense cold immersion can help fibromyalgia. So maybe this is another way to approach this, and to make some progress. And maybe if you get all this stuff together, then you can shift the whole system, start to shift the whole system back to health, as you've been able to do.
I think what the words that you use there, to shift the system, is appropriate.
Yes.
Because what we're talking about here is hormetic stress, and it actually doesn't work to just activate the parasympathetic nervous system.
Mm-hmm.
There's some actually confusion around Stephen Porges's work around ventral vagal and dorsal vagal and that sort of thing. There's a part of the vagal that cold exposure does, of the vagus system, that cold exposure does activate, but it's not really a relaxation response. It's actually a stress response.
Oh, really? Oh,
But
interesting.
yeah, just like sauna exposure, just like exercise and a number of other hormetic stressors, breath holding as well. So Wim Hof is combining cold plus breath holding, both of which are stressors. But
Yes.
this is actually a big topic that I talk a lot about. I've also had the pleasure of talking in person with Dr. Robert Naviaux about, and he, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but he agreed with the basic principle of my thinking, that hormesis, hormetic stress, is an important aspect of helping to the body to relearn a new set point of how to regulate itself. So
Yes.
these temporary challenges of stressors can help, as you said, use the words to shift the system in a certain way. So by this, it's kind of counterintuitive for a lot of people, because you think, if I'm unwell, I want to avoid stress. But the reality is that in order for the system to learn how to regulate itself, it actually requires some input of stress to learn the appropriate way to regulate itself and to have resilience to stress. And if it's never exposed to stress, it can never learn how to be resilient to stress. But the challenge, obviously, with people with severe ME/CFS is getting that dose right. And some people are so sensitive that even a small dose can send them into a bad place. So that aspect of things is certainly a challenge. But I do think hormetic stress is a key aspect of healing.
Interesting. It makes sense to me. Nancy Klimas has done these using these supercomputers, created these models of how people with ME/CFS systems have shifted. and they indicate um, that they've kind of like shifted into this suboptimal space, but that they're embedded in this space, and and she shows it like there's a hill, and then they're down in this space. Their whole system has shifted this way, but you have to climb the hill in order to get back to the optimal space.
Mhm.
So which suggests that it'll take some real work. I mean, the system is stabilized. It's not in a good place, but it's stable. So it's going to take some work, uh, and which sounds like your stress thing. And actually, I know somebody. His name is Dan Moricoli, who had a terrible case of chronic fatigue syndrome, and his limbs would like flap around, and he was told that his nervous system had just forgotten how to handle his limbs.
Mhm.
And he's one of the he's a really interesting success story because he was so ill, and he actually just used yoga and meditation and very, very careful, very slow exercise, very slow. I mean, you wouldn't even call it exercise, but he just slowly over time he returned himself to health.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it did require stress. It did require very small, very finely tuned, additions of stress until they got bigger and bigger, and finally he was able to. I
Right.
think we would all love to do that. And it's just so hard. I mean, I'm sure I'm continuously overdoing. I'm sure every time I take my dogs out for a walk, I feel compelled to get them some exercise. I'm just pushing it a bit too much, you
Mm.
know? So it takes real discipline. It
Yeah.
takes real discipline to do that. Yeah.
Yeah, and finding your personal correct dose for these things also
Right.
takes a lot of discipline,
Right.
and not overdoing it, especially if you're a very driven personality. You tend to overdo it.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. So,
I think this drivenness, I think it actually comes with chronic fatigue syndrome. I
hmm.
don't remember being driven like this before. I think it's just part and parcel. I mean, it's a weird thing. Your your energy is depleted and yet you feel driven. I mean, it's the wired and tired thing. It's just the oddest thing.
Well, you're also maybe an interesting. I don't know how unique of a case you are in that regard that you're talking about, but you found your passion, obviously, and trying to
Yeah.
help advance our understanding of ME/CFS and help people with this condition is obviously a big driving, motivating factor for you as far as your own personal purpose and mission in life.
Yes. 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 It is. I was lucky that way. I was really lucky
Mhm.
that I was interested in science, and of course, there's this huge thing that changed my life utterly,
Mhm.
and I was able to combine the two and still work. So
Mhm.
which is which is good. I
Yeah.
mean, it's good. It's good, and it has its downside too. Because,
Yeah.
like I said, I'm driven. So
Yeah. Court, do you have any thoughts on long COVID? I know you mentioned this at the beginning, but do you have any thoughts on long COVID and how that ties into ME/CFS and just as far as all the funding coming into the research community to fund long COVID and how that relates to ME/CFS? Is there anything else you wanted to say on that?
yeah, really, just to stay tuned. We're going to be. I'm covering this subject heavily on Health Rising, uh, because, as I said, I think this is the breakthrough that we've been looking for,
Mm.
um, and it will help. The more we understand about long COVID, the more allopathic, the more options for allopathic medicine to treat it. Um, uh, Allopathically. So some of the things that have shown up. One really interesting finding from Avindra Nath, who's already studying chronic fatigue syndrome. He's been doing these intensive 2-week dives into MECF physiology. He's looking at exercise. He's looking at the brain. Doing all these blood tests. It's really an amazingly intensive study, and so he's now carried on that study to growth war illness and to long COVID. And but what he found that was most interesting was he did autopsies of long COVID or COVID patients who died, most of whom, interestingly enough, did not had mild symptoms before they suddenly died.
Mm.
Uh,
Wow.
and he found leaky blood vessels in the brain, and he believes that depending on where these leaks come from or occur, um, depending on where those leaks occur is where he thinks the symptoms is the different symptoms he's finding correlate to where the position of the leaks in the brain. uh, and the interesting thing about that is about 20 years ago, uh, researchers, it was one of the first findings in chronic fatigue syndrome, and they found these evidence of these same leaks. They're called punctate hypoperfusions, I think, and they were scattered all over the brain. And but they couldn't figure out what was going on because they were in different places and different patients, and there was just no pattern that they could discern, and they just kind of gave it up. But maybe Nath is right. Maybe the I experience uh, these really kind of hot muscle feelings if I exercise too much. So maybe there's a part of the brain that my my blood vessels are leaking that corresponds to that.
Hmm.
Uh, so they're also finding already they found potential problems with the microcirculation, and they potential problems with the brainstem. The brainstem is another really interesting avenue in ME/CFS, and problems with the midbrain. So I think that's just the beginning, just the beginning. And he's going to get those patients on a bicycle, and he's going to exercise them, and it's going to be really interesting to see
Hmm.
what he finds out. So
Yeah, absolutely.
I think
Cort,
I think we can take heart. Both long COVID and ME/CFS patients can take heart.
yes, absolutely. I have one more question for you, and that is, I think we've talked in this podcast about a lot of different aspects of, the disturbed physiology, the abnormal physiology that's going on in people with ME/CFS. We've talked about or hinted at many different treatment modalities that people can use, and even some portion of people have recovered from. But
Hmm.
if you were to say to individuals listening to this with severe chronic fatigue or ME/CFS, if you were to say sort of your top three pieces of advice for them, as far as with everything what would be, if you could distill it down to your top three pieces of advice to help people? And these could either be, specific strategies, do this or don't do this, or just how to think about it, how, kind of a mental frame for how to approach things.
Boy, that's an easy question. Uh, um, so I would, for the severely ill, first of all, I would just say don't give up hope. Do not give up hope. In fact, we're going to do a series called Ending Suffering, which is designed to find ways to reduce the suffering, just so people can keep going. And suffering, um, you know, just being pounded by, it's just so difficult. It is so difficult, and you know, um, how anybody with severe ME/CFS or even ME/CFS doesn't have a severe case of depression, I don't know, because almost everything has been taken away. I mean, when you can't function, you know, it just takes away so much. I mean, a lot of people, they can't even watch TV. Um, some people they can't listen to music. It's unbelievable. I mean, the state that some people end up in, I think it's been hard for the medical profession to handle because they just don't see it. They don't see it much. Not in younger people who are functioning healthy and functioning well, who don't have cancer and aren't about to die. They just don't see it much. So find a way not to give up hope, and find a way to combat just just the depression, you know, I mean, you look ahead and you just don't see a positive future. So, and that's weighty stuff. That's weighty stuff. So
Yeah.
you can find a way to find some appreciation and some peace and just, you know, and just somehow come to grips, even just with a neutral position to the illness, not a positive, just a neutral position. That I think that would be very helpful.
Mhm.
Because that's just quite a stressor in itself. And there is no, like you say, there's no protocol. There's no protocol that will reliably work with the severely ill. Uh, and the other thing would be to try as many things, that are not drug based. They're not drug based because they can have really negative effects, and
Yeah.
some people get themselves in real trouble.
Mhm.
And if you're severely ill, you could probably get yourself in real trouble. So have somebody, get some people around you who can look at all the different options, from diet to blood volume. We did a blog on blood volume, and there are some really good inexpensive ways to increase your blood volume, you know and that in itself can be helpful.
Mhm.
And so I would really, and I know people with severe ME/CFS that just um, delving into the many different treatment options. It's just overwhelming. So diet. I would cut out the carbs as much as possible and see if that works. I would try these breathing exercises. We're gonna have a blog on that coming up. Um, and then I would give your protocol a try. You know, and these are safe things to do. These. I mean, people who are severely ill are very sensitive, but these are generally safe things to do. Um, and then I would just keep up on the science, because things are happening,
Yeah.
and who knows what's going to happen over the next couple of years. I mean, who knows? I mean, just the NIH started this. God, I think it's $170 million exercise study to find out what's happening at the molecular level with regards to exercise in the body. And here we are with this huge exercise problem. Do you think we're not going to learn a lot that we may be able to apply to ME/CFS?
Mm.
That study is a couple years old. So, I mean, it's not one study, it's hundreds of studies. So yeah, yeah, they're the future is brighter now than it's ever been.
Yeah.
Okay. It's not easy, but it's brighter now than it's ever been. So hang in there.
Nice.
Just
I
hang
like
in
that
there.
message.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
Cort, this has been very, very enjoyable. It's a pleasure to finally connect with you after, again, spending several years reading all of your articles. To everyone listening, I highly recommend you go to healthrising.org, sign up for Cort's newsletter. He's constantly staying abreast of the latest science that's coming out on ME/CFS and providing really excellent articles with commentary on research and putting it in the context of all the other research. So highly, highly recommend you go to that website, sign up for that newsletter, and just follow all of his work. Cort, is there anything else you want to say as far as just where people should follow your work or anything to that effect?
Yeah, just subscribe to the newsletter. We are coming out with some programs, with a new program. It's called, well, one of it aspect of it, that's the first part. It's called Lives Interrupted, which will kind of help people get a real understanding of the cost, the financial costs of having, that people endure having ME/CFS. But it's also part of this big map project where we're gonna provide ways for people to contact each other locally and put themselves on the map, and put resources and doctors on the map and rate them, and and, interact, even if they want to, date or things like that. So that's coming along in over the next couple months. And also keep an eye out for our Ending Suffering project.
Mhm.
And we'll probably use some stuff off your that you're doing, because you're looking into how I saw you just, I haven't seen it, but you did something how beliefs affect biology,
Mhm.
and we have a story on the website. This woman who had this autoimmune illness, and she did all this. She did, mindfulness, yoga, meditation, and at the end of the year, her immune scores had uh, gotten much better, and she was much more functional. She wasn't healthy, but it really helped. So
Mhm.
yeah.
Awesome. Cort, thank you so much. Again, really a pleasure to have this talk with you, and I really enjoyed connecting with you in person, or in real time, I should say. Um, and you're obviously staying on top of all the latest research that's coming out. So as new stuff comes out, that's exciting, that you're finding and that you're doing analysis on, please reach out to me. I'd love to have you on the podcast again, and to discuss all the latest stuff as it emerges. So thank you so much, and I look forward to doing this again with you, hopefully in the near future.
Well, thank you. It's been a real honor to be on the program,
Yeah.
and I appreciate that you reached out to Health Rising, and so thank you very much.
Yes. Yeah. And thank you again for the work that you're doing, just helping people with ME/CFS. I really appreciate it. I think a lot of people have benefited from your work tremendously. So thank you for that.
No, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Talk to you again soon, Cort. I hope.
Okay, good.
All right. Bye.
Good. Bye bye.
Hey there, this is Ari again. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, if you found it valuable, please share it with your friends, share it with your family, help me get the word out there. Also, if you're on YouTube, make sure to hit the subscribe button and hit that little bell to get notifications every time we release a new video or new episode of the podcast. And if you're listening to this, make sure to subscribe to this podcast on iTunes or on your favorite podcast app. Thanks so much for supporting my work at the Energy Blueprint. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I will see you in the next one.